Hello, my name is Luke Strong. I'm a recent graduate of Queen's University Belfast with a bachelor's in philosophy. And this presentation was my dissertation that I just submitted a month ago. So it's entitled The Psychedelic Experience as a Sublime Aesthetic. And the goal of my dissertation and now this presentation is essentially to establish a philosophical framework for understanding the psychedelic experience. So, in doing this, I'm first going to justify philosophy as an evaluative tool of the psychedelic experience, essentially show the value of philosophical understandings of psychedelics. Then I'll examine Burke's conception of the sublime as a potential framework for psychedelics. This is within the philosophy of art, which will be the focus of the presentation generally. And then finally, better understand the implications of a psychedelic sublime aesthetic. When I use that term aesthetic, what I'm referring to is an experience, essentially. Within the philosophy of art, it tends to refer to an artistic experience when you're viewing a piece of art, what you're experiencing, feeling, and such. But that can be applied to other situations. And as you'll see, that's my argument is that psychedelics can evoke a sublime aesthetic. So the first big question is why philosophy? Why is philosophy valuable in evaluating psychedelic experiences? And my response is that science is limited. You'll hear a lot of people throughout this conference talk about the science, talk about different numbers, brain maps, things like that. But that tends to quantify experience and break it down into easy to understand things. But I believe the psychedelic experience is rich. It's an experience in and of itself, and it can't just be distilled into these maps, numbers, and scientific understandings. There's a long lineage within philosophy of understanding experience through different frameworks, and I think that it's important that we apply that to the psychedelic experience. Some people tend to say that philosophy begins when science ends, but I believe that they can actually create um, different pieces of the puzzle to better inform our knowledge overall, and that they can work together rather than being separate entities. And that's essentially the focus of this presentation, is how philosophy can be valuable here. So on the Sublime, here's sort of the background of the term and what it essentially means, because there's a bit of a linguistic problem. When we use the word sublime, we tend to mean things that are amazing, things that are awe-inspiring, but that's not necessarily the case within philosophy. However, the roots of the sublime may exemplify, there's the sublime as a term in philosophy, may exemplify and show where that sort of um, dignified and noble, awe-inspiring definition came from. So aesthetic discussion of the sublime began in 17th century England. At that time, the philosophy of art was a hot topic to be discussed. And this translation on the left here of On the Sublime by Longinus, an ancient Greek author, dominated this discourse and defined the discourse largely on the sublime. Longinus was referring to rhetorical style and sort of trying to show what methods or tools would make an orator or a writer have the best impact within their readers and audience. And he pointed to grandeur of thought and strong emotions as like two ideas of what can really impart and leave a lasting impact on these viewers. It's sort of shock and awe as opposed to pleasant methodical persuasion. So Longinus thought that this shock and awe could really strike an audience and linger with them. And although that seems very forceful, it does tend to be noble or innocent in that it's good oration versus great oration. And the sublime just means greatness. So again, that's what I mean when I say that it's a very noble or awe-inspiring definition that we see in the term that we use in mainstream discourse. But when we talk about the sublime in philosophy, a lot of it is defined by Sir Edmund Burke here, who writes a treatise in the in the 18th century on the sublime. And specifically, he's creating a whole framework within the philosophy of art and building a duality between the beautiful and the sublime. On the one hand, you have the beautiful, which is things that we enter into a relationship with willingly. Like, imagine smelling flowers, right? We go into a field, we want to smell the flowers, we smell them, we feel loving feelings. It's just pleasing, simple pleasure. And that's the beautiful. And, you can attach that to art and how we experience art. But then on the other hand, there's a more um, demonic at times, even a term called the sublime, right? And this is rooted in the idea that pleasure and pain are not mutually exclusive, that they don't operate separately. And the Burkean sublime is about delightful horror. So you can see that combination between pleasure and pain together. And though again, it's terror at a distance. It's not just horror, plain horror, like shocking you and such. It's terror that is sublimated, that is you're secure, but you also feel terrified. And as you can see at the bottom, draws in feelings of self-preservation. It's something that makes you face your own mortality. It's something that causes a that response that you would feel if you needed to preserve your own life. So it's a very, very powerful feeling. And again, like within aesthetic discourse, we can talk about it with reference to art. Think about horror movies. A very, very good horror movie will create awe within you, but at the same time, it'll frighten you, and it genuinely frightens you, even though you know that the monster isn't in your house. You can be sitting safely on your couch, but still feel that fear, along with that awe that creates and makes it a great movie. And we can analogize it as an aesthetic within other contexts. Think about bungee jumping. You jump off a bridge, you feel like you're actually jumping off the bridge, but you have the security of knowing that the bungee cord is there to keep you safe. That's self-preservation as you're plummeting and feel like you are going to fall into the grounds, but security at the same time through the bungee cord. So that's essentially the Burkean sublime in a nutshell. This delightful horror, but terror felt at a distance. So Burke says, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. So as you can see there, a lot of terrible, horrifying things are present in the sublime. Um, and the importance, though, is right there in that last section where it says the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. And that's the importance of the sublime to Burke, is that it exemplifies human emotionality at its deepest. It exemplifies what we're capable of feeling, essentially. You can see an example there on the left, The Sea of Ice by David Caspar Friedrich, an example of a sublime painting that shows jagged ice, that shows like the natural beauty of this really thick, jagged ice, but also its power and its might against humans, because you can see a shipwreck there in the background. So it has that duality there that makes us feel frightened, perhaps, and um, makes us feel for our own mortality and think about that, ponder that. And in that way, it has that strong emotional response. So the key themes in sublimity are that one, pleasure and displeasure, two, strong emotional response, three, reinforces human might. And I mean that in a mental way, in that it reinforces the idea that our minds are so complex and capable of so much. And then four, it's vast, it is exemplifies vast awe. And this is goes for the sublime in almost any context throughout the history of discourse on the sublime. In my dissertation, I confronted a few different competing definitions, but I think Burke's is really key to getting at the psychedelic experience. So, precursor to a psychedelic experience, examining Robert Dickens, an author who wrote about Huxley's literary aesthetic in The Doors of Perception, examining it as a potential Burkean sublime aesthetic, essentially. So Huxley's Doors of Perception, if you don't know, is about his experience taking mescaline. I believe in the 30s. There may have been the 40s, not entirely sure. But what Dickens does in his paper is that he points to sections of terror that complement all. So throughout, Huxley's feeling this feeling of like, whoa, this world is completely different. It's amazing. Staring into flowers, staring into books, staring at his own genes, staring everywhere, just in awe of what he's seeing essentially. But they're complemented by terror. Um, there is genuine terror that Huxley feels throughout his experience, and you'll see on the next slide. But this makes the point that sublimity flows from the idea that psychedelic drugs infer a dual potential to both enrich and destroy any given individual. And this can also be seen in the fact that Huxley, after Doors of Perception, writes another essay called Heaven and Hell, which is about psychedelics and saying that they have the power to create both heaven and hell, which, harks directly on that duality between terror and awe. So an example of the fear that Huxley feels is this I suddenly felt was going too far. Too far even though the going was into intenser beauty, deeper significance. The fear, as I analyze it in retrospect, was of being overwhelmed, of disintegrating under a pressure of reality greater than a mind. So here you can see that he's feeling a genuine fear. This fear of being overwhelmed, this fear that he doesn't know what's going to happen. He's no longer in control, and he's just anxious about it essentially, and feels that genuine fear. But on the other side, you see at the beginning, intenser beauty, deeper significance. There's an element of all that's at play here. So these two sentences, or three sentences in themselves, do exemplify that duality that Dickens thinks is so central um to creating a psychedelic sublime. However, Dickens doesn't really create a framework that we can apply to other theories, to other psychedelic experiences, not just Huxley's. And he fails to critically evaluate the balance between terror and all, to understand what, like, if psychedelic experiences truly exemplify the right type of terror to be considered sublime. And he also never approaches the element of self-preservation. However, it's still a worthwhile framework to build upon and to create a psychedelic sublime from. And this is the most important part. What I'm here to do is to try to build that psychedelic sublime framework. So I think it's important to note that terror within a psychedelic experience is on a gradient. On the one hand, you have like very little terror felt, or maybe even no terror felt at all, ranging all the way up to these really intense moments, these bad trips that have dominated psychedelic discourse for decades, which I do want to distinguish from challenging ones, which have redeeming value in that they're balanced out with some positive things. So I'll give you an example of a bad trip right here. This is from a study on bad trips. I experienced what it's like to go crazy. It was much worse than torture and death because you're stuck in your head, and it's even worse when you know that you're stuck. So this right here, much worse than torture and death. Those are strong, strong words that show that terror has taken over. It's consumed this individual, and there's not much redeeming positive value here. Although this study, ironically, is about how, in retrospect, people tend to find value in these horrible, bad trips. In the experience itself and during it, it's pure terror. And there's no element of pleasure that can really balance it out or strike a sublime balance. So again, bad trips can't be seen as rewarding in an awe-inducing sense. But there is a much milder sense of terror in the psychedelic experience. Huxley says, in the intervals between his revelations, the mescaline taker is apt to feel that, though in one way everything is supremely as it should be, in another there is something wrong. So you see here that Huxley is feeling that something's not right, feeling anxious, and concerns, but it's mild. It's not something that's consuming him. It's not something that's worse than torture or death. And it's something that could be complemented and weighed out and evened out by all. And again, Michael Pollan here, who wrote How to Change Your Mind, I believe this is from his experience on psilocybin, says, this could easily take a terrifying turn, it occurred to me, and with that, a dim tide of anxiety began to build. Again, you see this exact same idea of mild terror. And this mild terror strikes a stronger balance with psychedelic awe. It's terror of what's to come, and obscurity to be an inability to see like what's ahead, essentially. And that creates that fear that's mild and can be balanced. Complementing this in a psychedelic experience or is sort of the ego death and ego dissolution into ego death, which is again the loss of a subjective sense of self. And when I say loss of a sense of self, that in and of itself draws on feelings of self-preservation because it feels like you are falling apart. It's something that's involuntary and forced, like Burke's definition of the sublime, where, with the beautiful, we enter into that relationship willingly. The sublime is something that strikes us. Um, and that's the same with ego death. This sort of feeling that all of a sudden we're pushed off the bridge and we're you know falling downwards towards the ground. But at the same time, there's a guaranteed reflexivity of the ego, right? Science has shown time and time again that this ego is built back quite robustly. So there is no need to feel that there's a psychological threat that's going to consume us. Again, like that reflexivity is the bungee cord that's able to provide some semblance of security that balances out these elements of self-preservation into one that truly is sublime in a Burkean sense. So again, this question of could this be a psychedelic sublime? And my answer is yes, because Burke's sublime accounts for the psychedelic experience at its most profound. It's not talking about sort of low dose psychedelic experiences. And again, I do want to clarify, it does not cover thoroughly adverse psychedelic experiences, those bad trips. But it does exemplify this psychedelic interplay between awe-inspiring feelings, terrifying strangeness, and the fight for self-preservation felt through ego death. Work Sublime truly allows us to grasp this complexity that's laden in the psychedelic experience, and creates a foundation by which we can understand um, these psychedelic experiences that aren't thoroughly adverse, that are like profound. Um, but then this raises the question of what's the significance of this and what are the implications? And I think number one, the Sublime lends increased credence to the psychedelic experience. These psychedelic experiences become analogous to artistic appreciation. They take on that role in that they're bringing to us the same feelings that we would feel if we were viewing a work of art that was striking us. Because again, it's not just artistic appreciation, it's artistic appreciation of sublime works, of works that have a power to put us in this state that brings out our strongest emotionality. And again, that emotionality gives even more credence to the psychedelic experience because it says, look what we can do when we really tap into this feeling. We can exemplify human emotions and its depth. And that can also be something that is interesting to study within the sciences and to understand that the psychedelic experience can bring us to that strongest emotional feeling. Number two, psychedelics serve as a chemical expedient to a sublime state. The Burke actually does make mention to the idea that exogenous substances could influence our emotions and, put us in an aesthetic like the sublime. It's largely neglected that, because the discourse is so focused on feeling art and engendering a sublime aesthetic through that art, um, it neglects the idea that you could sort of consume something and be in that state. And this kind of displays the need for further scientific inquiry again into the whether or not that state can have therapeutic value, because obviously we see that psychedelics do have therapeutic value and often are pointed to the ego death and as well this mechanism of challenging psychedelic experiences that have therapeutic benefit. And these are like the key things that are often pointed to as holding that therapeutic benefit. So it opens the door for more scientific inquiry. And then finally, this understanding of a psychedelic sublime allows for better preparation before a psychedelic experience. Essentially, if you go into a psychedelic experience knowing that there are just going to be a complexity of emotions, that it's not going to be pure, beautiful, everything's amazing, but that there are going to be feelings of strangeness, feelings of terror, that can better prepare someone for those feelings and also teach them that this is perfectly okay and to embrace them and make it a more positive and potentially more beneficial experience. And at the end of the day, this also reinforces the complexity of the human brain, that we can feel these feelings at the same time of pleasure and pain so strongly to create a feeling that shows our emotional depth. That's something quite profound. And that psychedelics can do that is really important and amazing to understand, both for science and philosophy. So overall, philosophy is an important way of investigating the psychedelic experience. And Burke's conception of the sublime grasps the deep complexity laden in the psychedelic aesthetic. Through a psychedelic sublime, our understandings of both psychedelics and the sublime deepen. We essentially become better aware of the ways in which psychedelics affect our mind and how that can be understood and broken down in a non-scientific, but yet crucially important way. Thank you so much for listening.